One. Live from London, this is the Sunday Morning Breakfast Show with Sobia Iqbal on Teachers Talk Radio.
Good morning. You're listening to Sobia Stellar Sunday. It's Sunday the 29th of August and it's a bank holiday weekend. We have the best conversations coming your way. How can we challenge the system to become better teachers? Dealing with rejection and how to deal with public shaming and humiliation. These are all questions we're going to be answering today. It's another thrilling morning. Prepare for takeoff.
Live from London, this is the Sunday Morning Breakfast Show with Sobia Iqbal on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live on the Podbean app or desktop player. Just head over to www.podbean.com/LSW/TT Radio or search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TT Radio.
Introducing my first guest this morning, Scott Butler has an extensive career in primary and secondary and has worked as a principal lecturer in universities, predominantly in education, psychology and inclusion. Scott has led degree programs from undergraduate to doctoral level and lectured on applied educational psychology, research methods and leadership. He also has a PhD in anthropology, is a chartered teacher and psychologist and has returned to schools to work in. We'll be discussing how to challenge the system to become a better teacher with Scott, and we'll also be coming back to him in just a moment. Good morning. Welcome to Sobia Stellar Sunday this morning. I have got a very good guest on the show. If you just give me a minute, I'm just going to connect with him to make sure that he can hear me loud and clear. Okay, so Scott, can you hear me?
Yes, good morning, Sobia. How are you today?
I'm very well, Scott. Thank you very much. I'm just going to check in with the studio whether they can hear. Can you just give me a thumbs up to let me know you can hear him? Right, we're going to carry on. Scott, can you explain your career history to date for our listeners? Because there are some people in the world of Twitter who still don't know who you are.
Oh, bless you. Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for inviting me on, and especially to the listeners today for listening over a bank holiday weekend. Now that's dedication. So my background, I completed a 4-year B.Ed primary in 1995 and then taught for 5 years in London, a few years in Birmingham. Then I was appointed a senior lecturer, especially in special educational needs and inclusion. I branched into the psychology of education, research methods, and the more general field of education studies. That's history, philosophy, psychology, sociology of education. I moved to universities a few times. However, I had this increasing unease with my professional practice. I felt that in order to be current in the lecture theatre, I needed to update my experience in schools. So I started back as a supply teacher and for all year groups and reception to A-level. And then I found a school that really resonated with me, where I've been for the last 3 years. It's an all-through school, and it's got remarkable students, great sense of humour, fabulous colleagues. And during this time, I completed a chartered teacher status with the Chartered College of Teaching, and that helped me transition back into the classroom. Also, I've kept straddling this line between academia and being a teacher. And currently I'm working as a Year 6 teacher and heading up computing across the school.
So that's quite an extensive career, Scott. So you've done a lot there. What actually led you to write a book about challenging the education system? Because clearly, even though you've worked across lots of schools, there was something niggling at you to write a book about it. What was that?
Thank you. Yes, when I first started teaching, there was a greater sense of autonomy where you could try out innovative techniques and practices. Where I did my 4-year B.Ed, I had some brilliant lecturers, including people like Pi Corbett, and they just really infused me to go out there and try things out. But the rest, I was seeing more and more control about this is the correct way to do such and such, only for it to then be discarded for the next new initiative that came along. So while I welcome change, the problem is a lot of this seems either uninformed or misinformed. How often are we told this is the way and we have to accept it? For example, I wonder how many listeners remember the literacy hour or the numeracy hour, brain gym, or the thrust in the early 2000s on learning styles. Now, all things come to pass, except Rosenshine's principles that seem to have made a resurgence recently. So in my perspective, the purpose of education is to free the mind so that you can find a sense of truth. Now, alas, with the initiatives from the government, some schools and even academy chains have increasingly seen the shackling of the mind. So having lectured in ed studies, as I say, is a very multidisciplinary area, and looking at how education has been conducted around the world, my mind was opening up, but unfortunately all I could see were constraints. I saw that higher education was, for example, becoming more market-driven. I'd witnessed some unethical leadership in some places. I was being told to teach this way by head of department because this was best in their view. And, you know, there are people or the same sort of books and articles that are still reciting those hierarchy of needs, even though he dismissed that back in 1970. So I had this increasing unease in education. And a colleague and I developed a module to challenge student perspectives on their own education. This module was called Radical Education. It had no learning outcomes, no objectives, no curriculum content, not even any set assessment. And the students could really choose what they wanted to do, how they wanted to be assessed. They even decided that they wanted to assess themselves and each other's work. So this was purely educational democracy in action. And my colleagues on the module and I, we were just absolutely stunned. The external examiner gave it high praise. We had people developing musical scores about the themes of the module. One student even presented at a national academic conference, which was just absolutely stunning. So consequently, this book is about those lessons learned, often the hard way, but I've learned them. What education could be without the shackles of administrivia, the increased bureaucracy, education being dictated by the loudest person in the room or those with perceived authority. So instead, I've been challenging all of this and calling for education to be seized back to give informed autonomy to teachers.
Okay, that's great, Scott. There's a theme centralized around anarchy. Can you briefly explain what it is to have an anarchist critique of education and why it's important for teachers to have it?
Oh my goodness, thank you. That's a question and a half. Okay, yeah, I really wanted to call the book Educational Anarchy, but between the publishing house and I, we thought it may not sell too well because people have got these preconceived ideas of anarchy. It conjures up so many conceptions ranging from a lawless society, maybe anti-capitalist riots, assassinations, and so on. However, these concepts are so far removed from what philosophical anarchy is about. So, although I discuss the roots of anarchy in the book, along with what it means, I would say that a working definition is that it's the collective group of like-minded individuals working for a common cause of the greater good. Now think about this, people coming together to share their ideas in a sense to benefit others. In essence, this is what social justice is, a theme that runs deeply in our society. Think about Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Pride, even dating back to Robin Hood and why he resonates so much in our psyche. So the word anarchy really comes from the educationalist William Godwin, whose perspective centered on the freedom and development of a sense of self. Now, as a transpersonal psychologist, the sense of self is very fundamental. He also stated, if you run an education system based on standardization and conformity that suppresses individuality, imagination and creativity, don't be surprised if that's what it does. Now, that was written 227 years ago, and it resonates so true nowadays. So will the same be true in 2248? So although there's been attempts to develop a true sense of anarchy in shaping educational systems, there's been many initiatives over the last 100, 200 years. For example, the Modern School in Spain, Paulo Freire's work in Brazil with his seminal book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Summerhill School in Sussex, and even groups like the Woodcraft folk, which, if you haven't found out who they are, have a look, have a Google. Hopefully some of the listeners are involved with them. So while education appears to be more tightly constrained, really asking for people to engage in an open, honest, research-informed discussion of education where things are tried out, evaluated, refined. Indeed, I dare say many of the listeners are already doing this daily.
Yeah, and I'm going to come on to this a bit later on, but there is this issue of there being two different camps and different types of research that's been used as what's good, what constitutes good and best practice. And that's what we're going to discuss later on how to critique research and, how to follow what we think is right. You mentioned another theme in your book, which is about change management. And what you say is one of the problems is that people, no matter their position or power, have little understanding in how to facilitate change. So my question is, you highlight the questioning of authority in your book and it being seen as an act of disobedience in schools. Is it an act of disobedience? And why are there so many leaders opposed to being questioned about policies and procedures in schools, do you think?
Thank you. That's quite an involved question. I'll try and isolate the different parts that you just asked there, Sobia. Yes. Well, I'd like to ask the listeners to think about the last time they actually questioned something they didn't agree with. How did that work out? For example, where did it stifle a promotion? Were you sort of castigated, or did you just not say anything, knowing that it was easier just to go with the flow, and as long as you were getting paid at the end of the day, why challenge the status quo? So one of the words you may hear is insubordination when questioning leaders. It's a great word, and I would say that insubordination is, it really identifies the difference between a leader and a manager. So a leader is willing to engage in dialogue. A manager expects you to comply with what has been said. But obviously both roles tend to blend, very much like a yin-yang symbol. So insubordination may be defined as willfully disobeying the order of one superior, and in many organisations, this can give grounds for instant dismissal. So even asking why are we doing this change now, can be seen as insubordination, but you're questioning authority. So unfortunately, from my perspective, I've seen very little in terms of educators understanding truly what change management process is. I'm aware of MPQH and other courses where this is touched on, and I'm aware of the coursework where you have to implement change and discuss that. But I think that if everyone at every level of education is more aware of this, then we could have more informed discussion. The sense of agency comes in, but I'll talk about that a little bit later, I think. So I discuss this quite extensively in the book. For example, the classic thief and Mortimer, the reasons for failure, such as inconsistent leadership, demotivated staff, a lack of capacity, a lack of initiative to do something different. Perhaps it's a lack of information or clinging to past practices, or even fear of failure. Through to people like Kruger's iceberg model, where change is constantly happening. If you think about education, at one point national curriculum was changing every 3 3/4 years, without any real consolidation before then the next change is implemented.
So Scott, just to interrupt you there, Scott, do you think that's because there's lots of regular change within our system? And I don't know about you, but what I've seen from schools is that we have to deal with the regular change that happens within our organisations, but we're also having to deal with conflicting change that's coming from central government or even local government, depending on whoever's in charge at that time. I find that a lot of staff are not able to question policies and practices because they don't know what their own educational philosophies are. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's this notion of where change comes from. I think really what I'm arguing for is that if we're more aware of the change process, for example, the ADCAR model, where it's about raising awareness of why the change needs to happen, promoting the desire to implement that change, giving them knowledge and the skills to engage that change, in ensuring people have that ability, and then reinforcing and celebrating such changes. Often we hear that change needs to happen, but we don't get to that why. So really, from a philosophical front, I'm asking, well, shouldn't education at all levels be questioning what is the best way? Things like literacy hour, I believe it is based on schools in one county, and then it was rolled out across many different schools. Now, for those of you who don't remember literacy hour, I've never heard of it. This is when we had to differentiate 4 or 5 different tasks per hour for literacy. This is late 1990s, I think. And we were told, well, we need to have it in place by September, but we'll actually train you on this in May. And it just seems to be the following May. So there seems to be a disconnect of us scrabbling around. So in terms of philosophy, it's identifying what your true core values are. Being aware that you do have a voice, you do have this sense of agency, and that you can question, and that really we should be questioning. The daily DFE mail shots come through. This is next thing to do. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to do. If we ask why with umpteen thousand bits coming through per month, we would never get anything done. But I think it's having those informed discussions, saying, okay, this is coming through. How we can adopt this? How can we best implement what we feel as a school?
Yeah, and I would agree with that, because you mentioned the concept of informed change in your book, and you do say that we have to make sure that the changes are in relation to evidence-based practice. But sometimes in schools we're time poor. Leaders are time poor as well, and sometimes, like you've just highlighted, sometimes things don't happen and there is no long-term forward planning. Things get done on a short-term basis. That's my experience of schools anyway. And I do think that it is important to remember that when you are a school leader, not to just run on fads and fashions. Like you've just highlighted, it is important to have your own values and think about how you're going to run your school, and what type of leader you're going to be. I mean, I do the same for my department. I pick and choose what I think is suitable for the way that I'm going to run my department. So in terms of schools ensuring that the changes they're proposing are informed in relation to evidence-based practice, how can we turn schools into research-based institutions so those conversations are regularly taking place, especially when it comes to decision making? Because there are some schools who are still not using research, or there are some staff still not using research.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it all fits together, the different themes that I've discussed. So I'm just going to reiterate some of these, and then that leads through to how and why research is useful. So really what I'm suggesting, and remember this is only my perspective, this is me just going off on one, but educationists, educators need to learn about the change process, where it comes from, why it happens. Otherwise you're told to do something and it can go, you can go, great, this is brilliant, or more likely you can be somewhere in the middle. I think, what is it, 15% accept change, 60% are sitting on the fence, and 25%, I don't know all my percentages out up there, sorry. I'm on Sunday, my mental math has gone to pieces. But they whatever change is implemented, they just refuse to engage in it, or they see negatives in it. But so we need to understand this change process. We need to become aware of how to read research critically from a range of sources. We need to understand the research process and understand the limitations of research as well. Looking at 2 or 3 different bits of research and trying to get that bigger picture, those terms that will be familiar with synthesis and analysis, and then articulate this effectively to one another to say, well, okay, how can we take the themes that have come across? I've found that this is a common thread going through this research literature. How are we going to implement this in our school? So research can be scary. There's so many big terms, there's conflicting perspectives and so on. Often students engage with research methods module in university, which is poorly received because the context of the research itself is set, and that students cannot see how it applies to the course that they're studying. And then this can resonate and leave a bad flavour about research as people go through their careers. So with teacher education being more and more constrained by what needs to be covered, the importance of research can be relegated, or lecturers do not feel they can provide sufficient coverage in such limited time. Yet if you think about it, a newly qualified teacher has potentially 40 years career ahead of them, and things will change. They won't stay the same. And they will get promoted, they will go into leadership positions, they will need to evidence that change. And yes, I can say, well, do this because I found in my own experience, my own practice, this works. But I'm not you. You're not me. We have different attributes that work. So what I would really recommend for most people starting off trying to engage with research process is have a look at the Chartered College of Teaching, because they've taken forward things like the Education Exchange, the Impact magazine that every staff room should have. I think there's one coming out on about 13th of September. And those are great topical research-informed pieces from practitioners that may stimulate discussion in your school. Another approach would be to have a journal club or a reading group once a week or once a fortnight. Either read one article, come back, what are your views on it, how can we embed this, or everyone reads a different article, comes back, spends a couple of minutes giving synopsis, and have that discussion about, well, what can we do with this? How can we take this forward?
And there's a couple of things, Scott. I'm just going to interrupt you here. Sorry, I apologise. There's a couple of things that I want to come back to. So one of the things is that when I was doing my PGC, and that was research based at that time, sometimes the theory doesn't necessarily, it doesn't engage in you can't use it practically with some of the contexts that you work in. And so for me, it's kind of like I went onto Twitter, and I'm pretty sure there are lots of people who are now using social media to find out more information and how to improve their own teaching and learn from CPD. But there's so much conversation out there. How do we find out which is the right information to use? Because, I mean, you've just mentioned the Chartered College of Teaching. However, there are other schools of thought which are using different practices. And I have to be fair here, Scott, because there is no one way. And if you're a new teacher coming into the profession, or you're a teacher who's never engaged in research before, how do you know who to follow and what's the right way to what is the right way to teach, essentially?
Yeah, thank you. That's what I would say in relation to that is it's understanding that sense of criticality. Now, the purpose of the education system is to ensure, the ultimate pinnacle of it is to get people to think for themselves, make sure things are informed by research, by practice. But it's a case of somebody reading and seeing what resonates. So let's say I've got 5 different articles that I'm looking at the best strategy to bolster self-esteem in the Year 6 classroom. I can put that into an open source journal database, and there's lots of online databases that you can use to find quite a lot of academic research. Most universities probably run some free access. As you say, Twitter, just having conversations with people, what are people aware of, or how can I do this, can lead. And first, when you're starting off, it can seem quite overwhelming. So it's understanding the search terms you're using. So if I return to that thing about self-esteem Year 6 classrooms, very much we're confronted with whole forests of research papers and research journals. But once we can identify the questions that we're asking, narrowing it down to the specific tree you want to focus on, to the specific branch, to the specific leaf, then it will narrow down the results you'll find when you're looking through literature. So you may narrow it down to about 5 or 6 core bits of literature. Then it's a case of just having a look through what are the common themes, how do they relate to one another, how do they differ to one another, have they been used in practice, have they been used in this society, in this culture, in this country, do they come from somewhere else? And those will give some ideas as to, well, maybe if I try this out, and it's that maybe that I really am advocating. Let's see what happens if we try this out. We can always go back to how we did things, but let's take that small step. Let's try this out. And as teachers, I believe we're doing this on a day-to-day basis. We're always going, well, we have last lesson, we didn't quite cover that, or that could have gone better, I'll do that next time. So that notion of reflection comes in strongly in our profession. Yeah, it's that taking that slightly more nuanced step forward, just to not be afraid of research, or to go to, I think it's chapter 6 in my book, it says about how to read research, how to really pull research together. And, there's other publications out there that will do similar things if you type in how to read critically. And, that's a cornerstone of any degree, I would say. So I don't quite know if I've answered your question there, but
no, that's fine, Scott. You have, and then from my point of view, I'm thinking that if this is the case, because obviously, like I've said, teachers are time poor and leaders are time poor in education as well. One of the things that does happen is when we do research, for example, and we do focus on change management, but the change has stayed for a short term, like you said at the beginning, and then we're moving on to the next thing. And I think maybe we should, like some leaders have already said, because I have been doing research on this, that we should be moving towards a different type of change management, which is more agile, so that we're, coming back to things and seeing what impact things are actually making, rather than trying something out, then moving on to the next thing, then moving on to the next thing. Because until we've tried something and we've tested it and we've kept it running for quite some time, we don't actually know what the impact is going to be.
Absolutely. I mean, what you just described there, Sobia's Jim McNiss work on action research, where you implement a change, you follow it through the cycle, you evaluate it, you narrow it down, you focus again, and you take that forwards. And it's, again, we pretty much do that subconsciously, I believe, in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. But when it comes to these more deeper level changes, yes, we need to have these open, honest dialogues and to say, look, I've tried this out, it just doesn't work. Whereas 2 or 3 others may go, you know what, I've tried this out, I've adapted it this way. And it's having those conversations. And I feel that sometimes the best CPD, I remember there's a school-based standard on effective CPD, and there's a lot of literature on what effective CPD should be. But the 1 hour or 2 hour course isn't necessarily it. It's engaging with these things like small-scale research, so that you can have these open, informed discussions. So, really, if anyone's got an inset to run, get the coffee out, get some biscuits, say, have a conversation with somebody about research or something that you've read recently or something you're going to try out this year. And it would be stunning to see what comes from that. In fact, most of my research has probably started off over a cup of coffee. But, I mean, it's modular. I was talking about when radical education started over a cup of coffee with a great colleague of mine. So, yes, it really is the case that we need to embed those changes. There's the sense that if we don't consolidate and we're moving on, we'll just be in this complete sense of flux.
Yeah, and I've walked into schools where I felt that my values were different, and I couldn't work it out for a long time, and this was during my younger years, and it wasn't until I explored further that it was literally down to conflicting perspectives and differences in educational philosophy. And this comes across in your book when you discuss the education system and its purpose quite clearly. Can you explain your thoughts on our current education system, and also what are your thoughts on the purpose of education?
Oh my goodness, thank you very much. How long have we got today?
We've got enough time. It's absolutely fine.
There will never be a one-size-fits-all education system. Let's engage with the thought experiment. Hopefully you've had your morning tea and coffee or whatever. Now, unfortunately, this is a little bit too close to home for some countries currently. And by this, I by no means want to sound flippant. So, I'm giving that sort of nuance warning beforehand. But let's say that the world engages in a mass catastrophe. Something wipes out every school, buildings, supermarkets, food processing places, water supply, and worst of all, and again, I'm being flippant, Wi-Fi. But we're left with a blank sheet of paper to plan a new education system to ensure the continuation of future generations. So once the givens are included, such as shelter building, water purification, food gathering, fire, what else would you include and why? How would you justify your current school subject expertise in relation to a new education system? Now, surely, if you can light a fire in different weather conditions using different materials, that's all that counts for fire making. Would you set a curriculum for fire starting, which has learning objectives, assessment criteria, monitoring, and even inspectors coming along and, with their black clipboards? Or how about water purification? Now, let's say you live in a place that's close to a fresh water running spring? Would you then need to include water purification on your curriculum? Would you prioritise fire starting or shelter building? But within this, research is pivotal. If we keep with this thought experiment, take food. There are many nutritious berries that are easily available to get. Some are very delicious and some are quite poisonous. Observing what types of animals eat certain berries, trying out skin tests, a taste test, trying out taste sample, and so on, would be a scientific approach to testing what foods are edible and what aren't. So returning to the concept of values, then where do these come from within a school? Is it the head teacher's vision that's embodied in a set of values? Or do they come from the school? Do they naturally evolve, a dynamic between the teachers, the students, the governors, and so forth? Is it top-down, or does it naturally evolve? Indeed, how many schools have revisited their values in recent years with current changes? Now, spending a year on supply allowed me great insight into the range of values in different schools. And it's only when I walked into my current school, it just felt right. It appealed. It was purposeful learning, a relaxed atmosphere, a student was celebrated as seeing themselves as opposed to trying to fit everyone into the same mold. So in essence, I'm saying identify your own values as an educator. Yes, we can cross off things like inclusion and all those things that we may have think is correct to say, but what truly resonates with you? Question where you're working and what you're doing, and in all honesty, be prepared to make a change if you're feeling uncomfortable.
And so my next question is that if senior leaders had different educational philosophies to their staff body, because that can happen in some schools, this causes conflict, and obviously then that means that change is much, much slower. How can we resolve that? Because there's two different types of conflict. There may be conflict with obviously the changes that are happening in school, depending on educational philosophies and research and how you see things, but there might also be a conflict with the whole system overall, which conflicts with your values completely. Because I do know of staff who do sit there thinking, well, I don't think the education system is right anymore. So how do we resolve all these questions that staff are going through?
Personally, having experienced just what you said, 26 years in the education system, I've experienced some conflict, frankly not that often, but it really is that case. I found solace through writing this book. It was my catharsis. It was me trying to make sense of the education system that's changed over the last 26 years, and it's going to be a long time before I retire. And so, how does that actually fit? How can I, do I actually quit? Do I try and get a leadership position where I can dictate the change that I see best, create the school around me that I feel comfortable in? So, as I say, it's a case of the profession, at all levels of profession, realising we need to engage in dialogue, and this is crucial for it to be held as a profession, and it's necessary at all levels, from teacher training and education through CPD, through perhaps a more nuanced role in Ofsted, but all levels need to appreciate the role of research to further education, that sense of dialogue, the sense of agency, which is where you're having a discussion. You may have two opposing views. You may walk away from that discussion going, well, I'm still going to keep my view. But by having that discussion, you've moved slightly closer to a more universal brief about education. It relates partly to what Socrates asserted, that the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. Can we disassociate ourselves from what we hold as true, engage in discussion, and work towards that greater truth? So I think that we need to be quite what's the word? Look at ourselves. Take a long, hard look at ourselves as professionals and as a profession, and question, hold up that mirror, see us through everything in that mirror, and try and find what we are doing and why we're doing it. And I think that those two questions are critical, and we need to revisit those on a day-to-day basis.
So, Scott, I'm just going to come back to you and ask you again, how can we ensure the research we are using is the right research or the truth? Because when I go onto Twitter or when I go and do some research, there are two different camps. You've got the progs and you've got the trads. How do I know if I'm a new teacher coming into the profession, or if I've never engaged in research, how do I know which is the truth?
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to let you into a secret of research. Now, this is one you won't hear from the ivory towers of research. And it's the only thing that research demonstrates is that you need to do more research. So it's like holding up a candle in the corner of a very large room that is being decorated. You'll only ever illuminate one part of the room at any one time. By the time you return to where you started, things will have moved on. Research education doesn't take place in a vacuum. Society continues to change as do the subjects we teach. I remember the time before Windows was invented and you had to load up Microsoft Word on a floppy disk. And here I am supposedly leading computing across the school. I've had to move on in those times. But in terms of if we can hold central anyone who says, well, research shows, show me that research, because anyone, if you can tell me a piece of research that proves, the right way to teach, I'll then show you two or three pieces of research that probably are contrary to that. And it's finding what works for you as a teacher. It's taking your own personality, your own attributes, your own fields, your own subjects, skills that you're working with. It's balancing all of those and then trying to see what works for you. If there was a one-size-fits-all education system, we would have found it by now. We would have posted it. But as a profession, and this is a word that I keep coming back to both in the book and both through today, we need to constantly challenge. We need to constantly look at, engage with, discuss, reflect, research to continue moving towards this truth of what is education and what are we doing. I think this is a quest we will never get to the end of, but we'll become richer for doing it.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with you on that is something that we need to continue looking into. And also, I'm just going to bring up something that Tom Sherrington said, which I do agree with. And he says, my general argument is that however we define the supposedly opposing poles of traditional and progressive pedagogy, they both have a vital role in a child's education. And he's not suggesting that there's no distinction, and he's probably been wrong in the past as well, but there is definitely elements of each disposition that are distinct, and the two camps are real enough. However, they're not in opposition. They are intrinsically linked facets of excellent learning and an excellent education overall. They might even be considered to exist in a symbiotic relationship. Now,
absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely, what Tom said, it's absolutely spot. In recent years, we've had this skill versus knowledge-based curriculum. We need both. We need this harmony. At certain times, if you put these on opposing ends of the fulcrum seesaw, sometimes it will be more loaded one way, depending on the context, the content, the lesson objectives, and so forth. Sometimes it will be loaded the other way. It will never be one side or the other. I think it was Parry, 1970, who was talking about, the 7 levels that we need to go through, and we need to keep this open mind and keep revisiting. So, one thing that's fundamental to me, both as a martial artist, as a transpersonal psychologist, having written my PhD on Eastern martial arts and stuff, is this sense of the yin yang symbol. You need the element of both within it. Actually gives rise to the other, and times will be, the predominant one. At other times will be, and I think this is really what makes our profession exciting. One can possibly do if we are engaged in a state of flux. We've got to enjoy it. We've got to enjoy this sort of roller coaster. As we'll be high, closed, embrace it, and go with it, and try and steer.
And so in your book, you highlight that political interference and bureaucracy is an issue. How, and can you explain this in more detail?
Yeah, sure. If we look at the last 18 months, we'll see perfect anarchy in action. So return to our thought experiment. I saying earlier, schools were given less than, 48 hours notice to completely change their way of doing things in March 2020 when the first lockdown. The schools did a remarkable job in adapting to that change and continue refining what they were doing during that first lockdown. Also, in turn, many schools were talking about, okay, we need to step this up. We need to look at potential future lockdowns. Certainly, I was working with a brilliant colleague, Harriet, at the school I was with. And, we were running weekly sessions on live streaming. Yeah, we had quite a low confidence rate in going live. But we turned that around, and what teachers were developing during the second lockdown. And remember, the second lockdown came with, 12 hours notice. So I just stupidly stayed on that Monday, did all my photocopying for the week, only for Boris to come on and say, okay, we're going to stop. So, we had to adapt to that change immediately. And throughout, we saw very, very little from the government. Indeed, what was often too little too late if we think about access to machines and Wi-Fi, etc. Now, that isn't a criticism, it's just the way things are. We could take the current assessment issues in the past year or so, and again, see how educators stepped up in face of direction and leadership from government, or what's being perceived as too little too late. But alongside this, we have seen the polarised nature of education workforce. We've been constantly criticised by the media, some politicians. Yet, I think that all our listeners, all the listeners today, will vow that they've never worked so hard and so late into the evening of weekends they have for the last 18 months. So consequently, this last year is seen as the perfect example of our educational anarchy in action. So let me return to that original definition. It's a collective group of like-minded individuals working for a common cause of the greater good. Now, isn't that true of what we've achieved in the last 18 months? Naturally, from within our school, as opposed to it being top-down, led by bureaucracy and so forth.
And so, again, it comes back to this idea of change in schools, and you've just mentioned top-down approaches. How can we, as middle leaders, or even teachers in the classroom, influence and bring about change in schools where there may be huge resistance to ideas? And it could work both ways. It could be that SLT are resistant, or it could be that the staff body are resistant. And how can we work together to bring about that change that's needed, and also using the educational philosophy or the research that is best suited for the context that you're in?
Okay, so I think it's this case of return to some of the themes I've said about identifying what we do and why we do it. That we need to be aware of really what does philosophy mean. Things like metaphysics, the questions about reality in context of the classroom. Why am I teaching this content? What are the core themes all students need to know? The epistemology. How do I know that this is the best way to teach this lesson? Axiology. Now, these are terms, so things like axiology or the ethics of what is right or wrong, where we continue judging the risks versus benefits of what we're doing in the classroom. And these are terms that often you won't hear about in education because they're scary big words. And sorry if that sounds quite patronising. It's not designed to be. It's just they're words that I've only come across over the last 10 years. But it's trying to be confident in who we are, be confident in our own educational philosophy and identifying that. Now, one way we can identify that, I don't know if many listeners remember Jamie's Dream School. It was on Channel 4 in 2011, and Jamie Oliver found different teachers, people who are at the top of their field, so Starkey for history, etc. And he made a school, ran it for a few weeks to see whether it could help motivate some students. If we were to identify our own school, let's say that we were a head teacher, who would we have to teach PE? The Olympics, etc. Would we choose one of our Olympians? Who would we have for music? I'm a great fan of the specials. I've got a new album coming out, I believe, next month. But for the book, I'm going to interview the bass player, Horace Panther, because he was a teacher, and it was sort of, and what he said about education was eye-opening. And it's looking at all these different teachers we've used to populate our own schools and thinking about what qualities do they bring. identify 2 or 3 common qualities, and guess what? We'll probably find that those are the qualities we see as our own education philosophy. So I think the first thing that we all need to do is be aware of our own education philosophy, be aware of change and how to effectively lead change, how we can understand where change comes from, and also engage in research, from reading critically to actually doing our own research. But from these 3 points lead to the final aspect of being able to have this open discussion. And if anything, I just want to have a clearer discussion within schools and within every sector of education where we can just move forward. We can, it's not seen as a chance to say why, what could we do, and ask those open questions.
Yeah, I think I'm going to agree with you there, but I think one of the problems is, Scott, based on my experience, and I've been in the profession 16 years now, there are occasions when you know what your values are, what your educational philosophy is, you know what the research says based on what you think, and obviously that is in conflict with some senior leaders, because obviously they're running their school the way that they want and the values that they want to, the way that they want to run the school. And I think in those cases and those instances, I would suggest to new teachers coming in or teachers who've never engaged in educational research, really think about whether this is the right school for you or not, because sometimes it's not worth the conflict. I have been in a school where my values were completely different to the school, and I just felt like a fish out of water. And instead of battling through and trying to create change, it just wasn't worth it in the end. And I think that's where you have to, as an educator, think realistically about what type of change you want to make, how you want to challenge the system, and whether you're prepared to take on different types of challenges. If there's a small challenge, sure. If it's a huge challenge, it might be too big and you might not be able to deal with that. So you might have to move schools in order to feel content with the way that you're teaching.
Absolutely, Sobia. I'm sorry that you've come across a school like that. And I think that what you've been saying certainly is what I've experienced in the past personally. And it takes a lot to make that step. Sometimes you can step into a great unknown. Sometimes it could be proverbial out of the frying pan into the fire. But you've got to look after your own mental health and well-being, and this is pivotal. We can look at what the unions or research says about teacher stress, burnout, and so forth. But if you're somewhere that doesn't work, it's the reason I went on to supply. I just needed to find something that resonated with me, and I had the opportunity to look around different schools, and thankfully one school kept asking me back, and it was a school I'm at the moment because I resonated with them, they resonated with me. We just, I couldn't be happier, to be honest. But yeah, that takes a very brave step to identify when things aren't going right for you, especially if you're early into your career, especially if you've got a rental or a mortgage to pay or things like that. It's a very brave step. So I'd also invite anyone in that position to contact unions and to keep a paper trail of any evidence, just so, because it may not just be you, or you may need to call back on those things. There's educational trusts that can help out financially. So get help is the core thing. Talk to people on social media if needs be, or just have those conversations. But your mental health and well-being, if that suffers, then you're not. We don't want you leaving the profession. We need people to stay in the profession.
Well, yeah, that's important, because sometimes it does get to the extent when, if you are a new teacher and there is all this discourse that is happening, it can lead to disengagement. People do get turned off, and obviously, like you've just said, Scott, it is important for teachers to reach out to more experienced colleagues and not feel like they're on their own, because this is something that's happening across the whole profession. Now, Scott, one thing that I was reading, and unfortunately for my listeners, I apologize because I can't remember who wrote the blog, but they were saying, and I do agree with this because I have seen this in my experience as well, Now, in education, we work on a short-term basis. So, for example, we don't think about the long-term educational journey of a student. We don't think about the fact that they've just finished primary school, they've just gone through secondary school, they're going to go to sixth form, and then they're going to go to university. And that becomes a problem because we're just focused on results. We're just focused on the little bit that we're delivering, not realizing that we're actually contributing to a much larger educational goal. You worked in higher education and you mentioned the McDonaldization, of higher education. Can you explain what you mean by this? Because obviously higher education is changing or has changed. Can you just go through in detail what that means?
Absolutely, yeah. It's not a term I've come up with. It's a term coined by somebody called Ritzer in 2008, who says that higher education is now akin to a fast food chain. For example, there's value efficiency, massification, getting as many people through the doors of the education system as possible, calculability, using performance measures to monitor the quality and effectiveness. So things like league tables or national student surveys. Predictability, you know what you're getting from one fast food restaurant to the next. And it's the same with education programs, same with our curriculum, and also control where every hour and every activity is monitored and accounted for. So that expansion of higher education has worked well. It's benefited more students, it's created real social change and so forth. But the shadow of all this is a lifetime of debt or long-term debt, getting students used to the idea of being in debt, and that it's an accepted norm. There aren't necessarily the graduate jobs available out there. So when I think about a course I used to run in rurally deprived areas, accepting non-standard entry students, mature students onto degrees, then the degree I was running, it led to true change. Many progressed on to PGCEs, and I know that some are even head teachers now. So in the book, I proceed to say how the model of McDonaldization from higher education is being adopted by the compulsory schooling system through macadamization, that sense of forced academies. And from this, I question whether it's the right way to go. I've experienced some extremely good academies and some, I think if I was to say, I'd probably be sued, although a quick search on Google about people who are no longer allowed to run academy chains may reveal some names and why they have been struck off. But the National Education Union's written an article, The NEU Case Against Academization, which is well worth a read. So it's becoming a bit of a one-size-fits-all, I would say. But this is where my anarchist critique of education is: what is the purpose of what we're doing? Is it there to free the mind? Is education, is that true philosophy? Or is it there to get people to get grades? Or, referring back to what Tom Sherrington said, do we need a little bit of both of those?
And you've discussed a lot on change and educational philosophy, and obviously the fact that a lot of it is political. Can you talk to us about psychology? Because for our listeners who don't know, Scott has published books on psychology as well as challenging the system. We didn't have any modules in my PGC on psychology, but psychology is really important in the classroom. Can you explain what the book is about and why?
Yeah, sure. Let me just give a quick overview of psychology. It's a stunning field of study. It was one of the A-levels I actually passed. I absolutely loved it. So we're talking, the late 80s, early 90s when I did that. Came across it more in my BS. And it was only really when I was teaching it at university and I was making more sense of how it relates to education. So simply defined, it's the science of mind and behaviour. Everything we do within the classroom is underpinned by psychology. For example, the book covers perspectives on different learning approaches, the neurological, physical, cognitive perspectives, social, emotional development, the sense of self, motivating learners through facilitating intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. So not just necessarily relying on rewards, but how can we get students to do things because they want to do things. Mental health, well-being, behaviour management, then through to the psychology even of classroom layout. Indeed, the book, Psychology of Teachers, it discusses how all teacher standards have a psychological underpinning and that each standard can be met through a psychological perspective. Now, unfortunately, courses, as you've alluded to with PGC, can be quite constrained. Indeed, any professional course or qualification can only offer so much. And this is why it's imperative for any educator to continue to engage in proper CPD for teaching to be called that profession. It's that continuous learning. So really what I would say is that the notion of psychology, that wider sense of stuff, I've said this word earlier, transpersonal psychology, is a thing that nobody knows anything about. It's a very small field within the British Psychological Society, but it's things like the sense of self, wider sense of being, what makes us motivated, what gives us awe and wonder, how can we truly connect, mindfulness, all manner of themes like that. So, it's a very rich subject area, and it's one that, even if we don't know what theory it is, we're using psychology in absolutely everything we're doing from day-to-day basis.
Great, thanks, Scott. What's next for you then?
Oh, goodness. Well, cup of coffee after this, I think. There's so much I'm looking forward to this coming year. I cannot wait to reconnect with my students. They're my lifeblood as a teacher. Now, I know that will sound really corny, and I'm sorry to anyone but anyone who knows me well will appreciate what I'm saying and the importance I've always placed on the teacher-student relationship, both within schools and universities. So I can't wait to meet my new Year 6 class. I can't wait to see my old Year 6 class and being Year 7s now and seeing how much they've changed over the holidays, for example. Just reconnecting with colleagues again, and I just feel I've been a bit isolated the last few weeks. But also over the summer, I've been working on a new book for Stage Publications called Essentials of Research Methods in Education, where I'll bring out more of the themes that I've discussed today. And I'm co-authoring this with a fantastic colleague, Harriet Moore, who I've worked with on 2 publications on e-learning and things. And but I mean, the main thing is, just really looking to seizing this year. I hope it's a year of normality, whatever normality is for all of us. And just feeling really excited about the new academic year.
That's great, Scott. Good luck in the next year. We look forward to hearing more from you and seeing more from you. It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you today. We have had a few technical issues, but it's been wonderful listening to your thoughts. And I will mention that Scott does have a book which is How to Challenge the System and Become a Better Teacher. And for our listeners, Scott today has just been mentioning to make sure that as teachers we should be critiquing the educational research that we're getting or we're reading. We should be thinking about our philosophy, our values and visions, and we should also look at the perspectives that we have in education, and we should be basing our values on that and the schools that we're working in. And if you are wanting to change the system, you need to think about very carefully engaging in dialogue, making sure you're setting up maybe journal clubs in schools, having discussions with staff about the best way to move forward. There's lots more. I'm not going to go through everything, but if you do wish to find out more information, you can obviously find the book online. And also, Scott, you have a Twitter handle.
That's correct. It's ScoBuck1, or type Scott Butler into the internet and you'll find a few pages out there with my profile on.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to hear from you today, Scott.
It's been great talking to you, and may I wish you and all the listeners well for the new academic year. Okay, keep doing what you're doing and just make those little changes, and can't wait to talk to you another time. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Okay, we're going to move over to the news, and then we're going to come over to the next topic of the day today, which is all about rejection. So we'll see you soon.
Creative Resources, made for teachers by teachers. At Creative Resources, we've been rethinking what a classroom can be. We've created a huge range of more than 2,500 original and exciting resources that span across more than 15 different subject areas. Whether you're looking for primary or secondary level resources, careers options, PSHE, arts, or humanities, Creative Resources have the resources for you. We offer full curriculum packages and unique, challenging escape rooms themed on topics such as Shakespeare, Tudors, and fractions. We have quizzes, task cards, Tarsier puzzles, and lots more. Better still, more than 100 resources can be accessed for free. Just visit our website, www.cre8tiveresources.com. You can get 10% off any order you make on our website by using discount code TTRadio. Creative Resources, made for teachers by teachers. Every teacher loves stationery, right? Imagine getting a selection of fun, beautiful, and unique stationery items designed and selected especially for teachers, delivered through your door every month. You need to check out teacherslovestationery.club.
I'm always so excited when the box arrives. It's such a treat.
My Teachers Love Stationery Club box is just a little treat to myself every month.
It's always full of delightful and surprising items, including some really good quality stationery brands like Faber-Castell and Stabilo.
And because you never know what you're going to get, it makes it even more fun and special when you get it.
It feels really great to be supporting a family business that's run by real teachers. I can't help feeling like they just know what I'm going to enjoy using stationery-wise better than I do myself.
Visit teacherslovestationery.club and enter the code TTRadio when you buy your first stationery box to save £2 today. teacherslovestationery.club. Introducing the Leadership Masterclass series by Diana Osagi. Learn how to ditch your fears and develop your leadership confidence. How to deal with difficult colleagues. How to thrive when you lead in a challenging environment. And how to get colleagues to buy into your vision. Join Diana for her online leadership masterclasses, starting on the 10th of July and running all the way through the summer. These sessions are the perfect way to prepare and refresh for the next academic year and beyond. Book your place at courageousleadership.co.uk/events now. The first 50 leaders to sign up get an additional free mini coaching session with Diana herself. Don't miss this. Courageous Leadership Masterclasses at courageousleadership.co.uk/events. This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
High levels of COVID infections are likely by the end of the summer. This is the prediction of one group of advisors who, according to a report in the Evening Standard, are warning government to plan for this outcome. The Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modelling have suggested that the current vaccine rollout, which extends only to those 16 years old and above, will have made almost no difference to many pupils. Currently, only 12 to 15-year-olds who are most at risk from COVID or who live with people at risk are eligible to be jabbed. In light of the warnings, the leader of the largest UK teaching union has called for the Education Secretary to support schools to consider face coverings from day one of the new term. Kevin Courtney of the NEU said it was only right to recognise that a large percentage of schools would not be vaccinated. The experts say it is highly likely there will be an exponential increase of the virus amongst school-aged children, and they highlight the fact that fewer mitigations, such as bubbles and strict rules on isolating, will be in place. The report was issued on the 11th of August, but with cases in Scotland rising and the increase being partly attributed to schools returning earlier this month, all eyes will be on the return of pupils across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Union leaders continue to express concern about the possibility of large numbers of cases and the disruption it could bring to the education of large numbers of pupils for a third academic year. The view that the current government frameworks mapping a series of measures in response to outbreaks of the virus that do not go far enough is also reported to be shared by Julie McCulloch, Director of Policy for ASCL. She describes the report from advisors as extremely worrying and a recipe for chaos. She also pointed out that it would now be helpful to hear from the JCVI sooner rather than later about the possible offer of vaccines to 12 to 15-year-olds. In Scotland, the Scotsman newspaper is reporting that health services are ready to move quickly if the go-ahead is given to vaccinate some under 16s. This is as Scotland recorded 6,835 cases in the 24 hours to Friday, a daily record. In other news from Scotland, the opportunity to become head teacher of the UK's most remote school is now available. Ruth Stout, current head of Fair Isle Primary, has spoken to the TES about stepping down as head of the school, which is the most geographically remote inhabited island in the UK. The school currently only has 3 pupils on roll, but offers places to all children up to the age of 12. In a TES Scotland podcast, Ruth Stout discusses the highs and lows of being a head teacher on such a small island, one that is most famous for the intricate knitwear which shares its name. Anyone wishing to apply for the post should have flexibility in mind, as multitasking is common for both staff and pupils, and island life can be unpredictable and challenging. However, Mrs. Stout was quick to point out that many experiences you just wouldn't get anywhere else. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio Weekend News.
Right, brilliant. Thanks for that, Jo. Welcome back to the show. I've had a few comments come in. So Watermaid1 says, it's really important to challenge what we read from research papers. And I would agree with that. Unfortunately, sometimes people don't want to engage in conversations like this, and they become black and white thinkers, which is quite easy to do with educational research. It's important to explore things, and like Scott mentioned earlier, to base it on where you think lies best with your own educational philosophy and the values that you want to fit in with. Okay, moving on to the next session today, I'm going to be talking about an important topic. And the reason why I've decided to talk about this topic is because it rarely gets discussed. And it's something that we've all faced. We're going to talk about rejection today. We've all faced rejection at some point in our lives, and this could be personally, professionally, or even in social situations. So, for example, in a personal situation, it could be when a friend has cut you off, it could be not being invited to social events, and it could be being dumped or getting divorced. And in our professional lives, this could mean that from a young age, you're not getting the grades that you wanted, not getting into the right university, and as an adult, not getting the promotion or job you wanted. So with the rise of social media, we're now facing even more opportunities for rejection than we've ever had. And that becomes quite difficult. And it can be difficult emotionally for people as well. Some people use dating apps and they get turned off by the fact that they're rejected based on a picture. Or it could be being ignored or excluded on social media platforms. And we've also got call out and cancel culture now as well. Being rejected is really painful. And there's obviously a difference between minor rejection and major rejection. And it's up to you to decide whether it affects you or not and how it affects you. You have hurt feelings and you feel like you don't belong, and you develop a sense of fear, and excessive worry might compromise the quality of your life. I know people who have been rejected for a job that they've gone for and they've not been able to get over it. So rejection is when we perceive our relational value, which is how much others view their relationship with us. The emotional pain from rejection is very, very similar to physical pain. And in our careers, we will definitely face rejection at some point. And especially if you're a leader or in a senior position, you will definitely face rejection. I have in the past been rejected for a role, and it was emotionally painful. So this could be through lost promotions, such as the one that I went for. It could be for budget cuts, or it could be even your own team rejecting you. And rejection can be debilitating for some people. So let's just suppose, for example, that you've been rejected professionally from a job. It can leave an emotional wound, and it can take someone a very long time to get over it before they apply for another role. And mainly the reason why they don't want to apply for another role is because they want to avoid those feelings they got from the first time they were rejected. Now, some of the best leaders, both in education and outside, have had major rejection and setbacks and even huge embarrassment before they reach the top. And it's important for us to become resilient and to accept rejection and see it as an opportunity instead. We can't always control the external circumstances, but we can choose our reactions to those circumstances. So I was discussing this with a few people, and especially some educators, and we were discussing what unhealthy rejection behavior looks like. So let's suppose there's an activating event. Let's suppose you apply for a lucrative job and the outcome cannot be controlled. Your belief is that it would be awful if they said no. Your demands on yourself are that I must not be rejected, which means that if I'm rejected, it means I'm not worthy. I can't stand it if I'm rejected, and it will be terrible if I'm rejected. And the consequences from that would lead to anxiety and shame avoidance, which is obviously limited. It's rigid thinking, and it's also self-defeating. So how can we turn this into a healthier pattern of thinking or a belief system? Well, for a start, you could think something like this. I would prefer that I'm not rejected when I apply for an interview or a job, but if I am, that it's not the end of the world. It does not mean that I'm worthless, and I can stand it. I accept myself as a fallible human being. So essentially, we're looking at the way that we're thinking and what we're believing about ourselves and our self-worth. Now, rejection is hard, and it could lead to shame and embarrassment, and in extreme circumstances, it could lead to anger, especially if you've applied for an internal position and then you're expected to continue as normal. You may even begin to think and see rejection in other parts of your life, and that could cause to sensitivity that you're already feeling. That need for connection has been lost, and sometimes the angry thoughts are, how dare they, and who do they think they are? And professionally, the way you choose to react is really, really important. You are now not only dealing with the rejection, but you're also dealing with how to manage your professional perceptions of other people. So for some people, they will see this rejection as being judged and their worth being downgraded at work. But you have to remember that it's not always about you. There are loads of people who've had setbacks in their career. And in our professional careers, it's usually due to a number of factors which you can't control and could be political as well. You have to remember that sometimes it's not always the smartest, hardest workers who win, and that can be difficult to accept. So we need to think about the way that we're thinking about this and what we're doing for our own selves. So how can we build resilience to overcome rejection? Well, I thought about this quite a lot because when I went through rejection, I found it hard to deal with, and I found it exposing as well. I felt that I couldn't talk to other people about it because they would think that there was something wrong with me. And that's what shame does to us. It leads you to suffer in silence on your own. So I did some research on it, and these are the ways that you can build resilience. Number one, accept what's happened. You tried, you missed. It's not a no, it might just be a not now moment. So it might have been that you've been rejected from something. It's not that you're not ready. It's just right now is not the right time, or you're not in the right place. Number two, allow some time for yourself. Understand why it's happened. Is this rejection a good thing? And is it blocking you from something you're not going to like anyway? Is it a wrong match? And we discussed this earlier about what your own personal values are and thinking about what's right for you rather than thinking about other people. Number three, resist the negative self-talk. Sometimes we end up rewriting stories in our head. And you need to think about whether it actually matters or even if you care. So you need to think very carefully about whose rejection it is, whether it matters, and whose rejection you can ignore. And that's really important, but you have to learn how to ensure that you you have to ensure that you prioritize which rejection is important to you and which one's not. Number 4, focus on what you bring to the table and list the things that make you great. It may be that rejection is not a bad thing for you, because sometimes better things come along after the rejection. Number 5, process the emotions and thoughts and focus a lot on self-care. If you know you're going to be around people who you disagree with or you don't like, or they're going to be judgmental, remove yourself from the equation. Focus on yourself. Number 6, practice using affirmations. Number 7, spend time with people who love and value you, and that's your friends, family, and even the colleagues that support you. And number 8, develop self-compassion. Now, I have been guilty of that in the past, where I've not been so lenient on myself, and it's really, really important to develop self-compassion, because rejection isn't always personal. So it's always good to choose to assume the best of people and situations. You don't actually know what's happening on the other side. It could be that somebody has previously worked with the team before, and that's why they've been promoted. And it doesn't necessarily mean you weren't good enough or you weren't worthy. It could be that your personal statement needs more refinement to it. It could be that you just need to think about what you actually bring to the table and how you sell yourself as well. And finally, you need to get back out there. So even though rejection is painful, it does build resilience. You develop character and you become more flexible. Those people who've just gone up and got job after job after job, they never develop that resilience. And even though they may be fantastic and may be wonderful, it means that if they do have a setback later on in their career, they may not be able to deal with it as well. For some people, rejection does get a bit too much though, and it does lead to shame. And hopefully we've all read Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly, which was out many years ago. And I'm going to use some elements from her book which could be applied to leadership. She discusses the concept of shame and that it derives its power from being unspeakable. And that has happened to me in the past. And she says that shame loves perfectionists, which is why it's so easy to keep us quiet. It debilitates you and gives you a fear of not speaking about it, especially with other people. And there's this really good quote in her book. She says, "Only when we're brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light." Now, the concept of shame resilience is key to embracing our vulnerabilities. And I'm going to put this simply, we cannot connect if shame stops us from being vulnerable and if we're terrified of what people might think. So how does this impact us as educators? Well, there's lots of opportunities for this to happen. Let's say you've delivered a CPD session, or you've written a blog or an article, or even right now, like I'm doing a radio show, you've delivered something, you've delivered a product. Depending on how you were raised, you might attach your self-worth to it. If people love it, you're worthy. And if they don't, you're not. And that is a fundamental concept that we need to reframe. Because attaching your self-worth to what you create takes away innovation and creativity. And you also, as an educator, end up taking less risks. Let's say that something's not up to standard and you're crushed with the negative feedback. It could be your colleagues who give you the negative feedback after a CPD session. You start telling yourself you're not good enough. The same applies if you're given negative feedback in a lesson. So what's happened here, and again, I'm going to quote from Brené Brown. She says, if you attach your self-worth to what you create, you're in deep trouble. You've handed your self-worth to what people think. You get into a pattern of pleasing, performing, and perfecting. And it's really important, especially for new teachers, to remember that feedback on a lesson isn't about your self-worth. And that's when you have strong shame resilient skills. I remember when I was starting out as a teacher, I did link it to my self-worth. I honestly thought that if my lesson observation wasn't good, it meant that I wasn't good enough for the school or the leader I was working for at that time. Now, I blamed myself for that. And when I was doing research, I realized that in schools where you're nurtured, people are more open to feedback. They take more risks, and innovation and creativity is high. So if there's this element of nurturing happening within schools, it's very easy for staff to develop. However, in some schools, the cultures where leaders consciously or unconsciously, because sometimes remember, leadership isn't easy. Sometimes people aren't aware of their own behaviors. You encourage staff to connect their self-worth to what they produce. And that's when disengagement occurs, blame occurs, gossip, stagnation, favoritism, and a lack of innovation and creativity. I'm sure there have been lots of teachers who've gone and said to someone, well, that CPD session wasn't great, was it? We've all had those conversations. But the more I'm working in education, with the amount of teams I'm working in, it's really important to realize that people need to start from somewhere, and people are going to make mistakes. Even on Twitter, you see it all the time. Brené Brown also mentions a CEO of a global company called Peter Shayan, and he says that the secret killer of innovation is shame. Now, if you look at the major global organizations that are out there, most of them are innovative. And the reason why they're innovative is because their teams and their culture in those organizations and environment have been allowed to take risks. They've not been shamed when things have gone wrong. Shame holds back new ideas. It fails to give feedback, and it's afraid to speak up. You have a constant fear of being wrong. You have a constant belittling issue going on between top-down management, maybe. You feel less than, and then you don't want to take any risks in case you get something wrong. Shame is the fear of disconnection. You don't want your boss to think that you're not good enough, so you will go along with whatever they say. There's also a feeling of unlovable and I don't belong, and that could cause self-doubt and self-criticism. But we are human. We all make mistakes. There's a difference between shame and humiliation, though. So shame is when your boss calls you an idiot in front of students, for example. Humiliation is when you think, this is ridiculous, I don't deserve this. And in order to minimize shame, we need empathy and understanding. And that's where coaching does come in, because having those conversations to eliminate that shame and to prevent these things from happening is a good thing. So, for example, if you're a woman at work, you may think that you need to look perfect and be perfect all the time. You're always worried about being judged. You're always worried about being exposed. And you sometimes feel that you're never good enough for either home or work. And we go on to social media and there's even more criticism. And that's not just in our professional lives. That could be in our personal lives as well. By the way that you parent, by the way that you dress. Everywhere on social media, everybody has an opinion these days. For men at work, shame comes through failure, the fact that they've done something wrong, and the fact that society says that they cannot reveal weakness. Don't be weak. That's what society says to men. And shaming in front of peers has always been unacceptable in professional settings. However, social media has changed that landscape and it's now become normal. We spend so much time on the internet scrutinizing each other, debating, arguing. We punish people for small transgressions. And we've become this kind of online surveillance where we're constantly monitoring the actions and the thoughts and the opinions of other people. And some people do become fearful of that and therefore start conforming with those people because they don't want to be left out. Now, confirmation bias on the internet, especially on social media platforms, and call out culture and publicly vilifying people is common. Even if there's been nothing that's been said that's wrong, or even if someone's made an innocent mistake. And then you get things like pylons occur and there's no support for victims. And some people do it for thrills and others do it for morality purposes. And that comes down to online shaming. And in extreme cases of causing distress, you're criticizing arguments or people's work. You're getting someone fired for something that they may not have even done wrong. And people are basing it off on their interpretation of tweets and deeming what is appropriate, what are bad ideas, what are bad arguments, what are good arguments, and so forth. But as educators, should we be punishing individuals online, and should we be making examples of them, and should we even be suppressing their views? I'm not quite so sure about that, because if we look towards our professional standards, this also falls under personal and professional conduct. And I'm going to read out the professional standards. Teachers should uphold public trust in the profession and maintain high standards of ethics and behavior within and outside the school. Now, the lasting damaging effect of public shaming and humiliation could cause fear and have dangerous and devastating consequences, such as loss of employment or even suicide, as we've seen in the media with celebrities and the backlash that they faced. And even though there seems this sense of justice that you're fighting for a cause, it may not be, it may be that you end up doing more harm than good. And with mass humiliation, we don't need to face the target of our abuse. We don't see what happens behind a screen. We have no idea what the other person is going through. So when a colleague makes an off-color mark at a meeting, few people will respond by gathering people to berate the speaker publicly in an Orwellian 2 minutes of hate, then throwing them out of the building. That's what Brené Brown says. And internet trolls usually post comments designed to upset and disrupt conversations. So I want you to think about that the next time that you're using the internet and engaging in pylons. These people are usually narcissistic and they're not worth engaging with. And there's plenty of them on social media platforms. And without them, Twitter influencers, etc., and social media influencers would not exist. They've based their entire careers around it. There was a recent article written by Jonathan Shedler, who's an academic, and he discusses this phenomenon about academics and social media hostility in particular, and whether they should give up or not. And he describes academics dropping off social media to avoid abuse. And these people post about their field of study, and someone takes exception to it and then uses their timeline to fill it with hostility and hate. And they end up blocking or leaving social media. Twitter abuse includes insults, abuse, and threats. And suicide rates have increased, especially during the pandemic, because everyone's on the internet much more. Some people find it easy to shrug and move on, but are we normalizing abuse, and are we normalizing that it's okay to do this? If people stop doing their jobs, it would allow charlatans to take over. So the fact is that these academics who are online do need a platform as well. If we're going to talk about free speech is for everybody and not just with the arguments that you agree with. It's also been a major political tool for populist movements and keyboard warriors who claim to have free speech, who claim to want free speech. Disagreements can be aggressive, and demands are made for removal, sacking, and even imprisonment. And as I said earlier, confirmation bias exists, and there are plenty of tweeters living in their own bubbles. He describes it as a cultural rise of subjective truth. My truth is my experience. He also goes on to say that there's no uncertainty. So uncertainty meeting subjective truth is not covered when you're online. We become defensive, and unfortunately, not everything is black and white. And there are elements of uncertainty, which seems to be lost on Twitter or even Facebook. Now, there's a difference between beliefs, opinions, and evidence. And challenging our own beliefs is vital, as are critical thinking skills. No one should be cancelled, and everyone has an opinion, even though some opinions may be more informed than others. And let's not forget the good old Dunning-Kruger effect. People who have extreme confidence to not be able to know what they don't know. And if we look to our recent history, Donald Trump would be a good example of this. So the thing that I'm going to ask my listeners today is just to be careful when you're online and think carefully about how you're contributing to this. And especially if you're a new educator coming into the profession, please do not take this as the standard of how you should be within education. When I started education 16 years ago, social media didn't exist. It came much later. But when it did come out, we weren't allowed to engage in social media. I'm not saying don't use it. I'm just saying use it appropriately, in my opinion. Right. Thank you so much for listening today. It's been an absolute pleasure for being your host. It's the last weekend before work. Make sure you begin slowly and build up. Reach out to people for support and keep safe, because it is going to be another difficult term. Please do use the Education Support Network if you need to. The telephone number is 08000 562 561, and also the Samaritans if you need extra support or even emotional support on 116 123. Graham is up next, and then we've got Hareen later on. Khalil's not on this week. He will be back next week, hopefully. Take care, keep safe, and I hope you overcome any obstacles or challenges you may face this year to become the best versions of yourself. Have a great first week back. See you soon.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.